Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam O'Cone, and I work with Amity Advisory, and I'm pleased to be the host of the Inside Legal ESG podcast series. It is our pleasure to have with us today Dr. Shavana Haythornthwaite. She is the head of ESG at Morningstar. She's a recognized global expert within the fields of ESG, sustainability, international law and policy, businesses and human rights, and corporate governance. She has more than 15 years of experience in these fields, and she's assisted governments and multinational corporations with a wide range of sectors in this area. Prior to joining Morningstar, Shavana was head of human rights at the Commonwealth Secretariat, which involved providing legal and technical assistance to 56 Commonwealth governments and their private sectors. Other previous roles were at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the UK government's Stabilization Unit at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon. Shavana also has extensive academic experience, as she is currently an associate fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and visiting professor in international law and human rights at the China University of Political Law and Science. She was previously assistant professor at the University of Manchester and has held a fellowship at the Lauterpacht Center for International Law, Cambridge University. She currently sits on the board for the Information Assurance Advisory Council. That is an incredibly impressive resume, Dr. Shavana. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm actually thrilled to be with you, Pam, and very excited to talk to you about all things ESG.
Yes, so let's start there because your title at at Morningstar is head of ESG/legal. Tell me what that means and how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think in terms of the role itself, as you quite rightly said, I head up ESG at Morningstar, and really what that entails is being in charge of all things legal and regulatory as it relates to ESG across Morningstar Inc. So that's not just, one particular subsidiary, that's all our offices, at group level across the world. So it's a really, really stimulating role. I can certainly say that. I think anyone that works in the ESG space will also agree with me that ESG inherently is a very cross-cutting area. So my role definitely speaks to that. I work on a lot of diverse matters and actually work with a lot of different people and different departments across the organization. So, one day I could be working with our ESG rating side, other days I can be working with finance, HR, enterprise sustainability. So across the
Mhm.
entire sort of remit of Morningstar and all the different cross-functional roles that it has. I think my role, I will say, I won't say much more about it other than, I think my role is testament to the fact that Morningstar places a really high value on ESG issues. And actually, my work at the company is absolutely about compliance. It's absolutely about fulfilling regulatory reporting requirements and legal requirements. But it's also much more. I think what I'm also really thrilled about when I speak about my role and what I'm doing at Morningstar is really amplifying the leadership that the company has in the ESG space, which it is certainly a leader. And I'm just really, really delighted that I have the opportunity to sort of drive it forward in a positive way, as aligned to the values of the company.
And is it a new role or is it an evolved role? Tell me how this role came to be.
So it's something that, as I say, Morningstar has been kind of a leader in the space of ESG and sustainability for a number of years. And I think, certainly me being the head of ESG within the legal
Mhm.
team, it sort of complements the sort of already existing roles that have existed for, a number of years already in Morningstar. As I said, there's a fantastic enterprise sustainability
Mhm.
department that have been, responsible for our CSR reports for a number of years, and we've also just hired or got an ESG controller, which again is
Oh,
is
how
sort
wonderful.
of Yeah, another fantastic step in the right direction in terms of what Morningstar believes is a value. So this is sort of my role kind of contributes to that growing sort of strategic direction for the company that ESG and sustainability are important.
I'm so happy to hear that you have an ESG controller. I think that's like the next step for most companies to take because it's nearly impossible to manage all the data that you need for this job and for all the reporting requirements without having that kind of data expert in the background, expert with systems and controls and so forth.
Oh, completely agree. I'm also thrilled. And the ESG controller, I won't name her, but she's my new best friend. So we work together very closely.
Excellent, excellent. So in the past, and certainly this came out when I shared with our audience your bio, you've had a lot of roles that have had a specific focus on human rights. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thank you. I love talking about my work in human rights. I've been really lucky to have some amazing roles in the past. And, the work that I've done in the human rights space, I just think it's been of such value, not just from a professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective, because I think it's a really crucial topic. Um, as far as substance is concerned, really what my human rights work has entailed is helping companies or different kinds of organizations, but at its core, sort of multinational corporations with their human rights due diligence, with their human rights compliance. Um, I think one of the key instruments that a lot of companies look to and are sort of preoccupied with at the moment is the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights.
Mhm.
I think you'll no doubt know much about that, and I have I only think that that is becoming more and more prevalent within the corporate process at the moment. But certainly, the work that I've done with companies, I've been really privileged to sort of have an opportunity to sort of push the needle further, as they say, in that regard. I think we've still got a long way to go as far as human rights is concerned. Human rights and business is concerned, should I say?
Mhm.
I think there are still lots of corporate management systems that lack that real embeddedness of human rights. And there are still issues like modern slavery and forced labor that need much more attention. But certainly, as I say, the work that I've done in the past has tried to sort of push that forward in a positive way and a little bit more. And the companies I've worked with have been really, really attentive and expressed their commitment and shown that commitment to do more in this area. So I think I think that's sort of the crux of my work and the role that I did just before joining Morningstar, actually, as you quite rightly said in your very kind introduction, was the head of human rights at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And many people kind of know what intergovernmental organizations do, but they may not have heard of the Commonwealth Secretariat. And I suppose the best way to describe it is that it's similar, but also it has many differences to the UN. But it's sort of that ilk. It comprises of 56 member countries, you know, sort of from the Pacific, from the Caribbean, Africa, and they are all signed up to the Commonwealth Charter. They've, been members of the Commonwealth for a number of years. And my role was really about ensuring that these member countries and their private sectors were adhering and respecting and fulfilling their human rights obligations under international law and also the Commonwealth Charter. So yeah, so that kind of gives you a bit of a snapshot of my work on human rights.
And it's incredibly impressive with a very broad span globally.
Absolutely, yeah. So my work has always been incredibly global, and so the human rights work, global from this perspective of supply chains being so geographically diverse, but then also global in that, governments and organizations, they stem from across the world as well. So my work has always been really, really international.
So, given that international global perspective, What are you seeing as the hottest emerging ESG trends and hottest emerging litigation topics around ESG and human rights, et cetera?
Wow, Pam, you are asking
That's
an
a really big
enormous
question.
question. It's a huge question. And where do I start with that? There are so many issues at play here when we think about ESG and lots of trends that are emerging, but also emerged, but still, developing and lots of different issues to talk about. I'll touch on a lot of different ones. So forgive me for sort of not digging deep necessarily in
Mhm.
the issues, but I want to just sort of like, you know, give your listeners a bit of a snapshot of some of the issues at play. So I think it would be remiss of me not to talk about greenwashing
Mhm.
already at the outset. I think that's the one thing that we're seeing a lot, like the term greenwashing is being thrown about. This is where companies are potentially exaggerating their environmental and social commitments without necessarily having any substantiation or, evidencing them in any way. And so it's sort of, in a nutshell, this practice is sort of um, become known as greenwashing. And,
Mhm.
you also have something similar on the human rights space of human rights washing coming up as well. But just sticking to greenwashing for a second, I think it's becoming more and more important to have honesty and transparency around your sustainability credentials. And it's emerged and emerging more and more from regulators, from investors that um, this is absolutely crucial. And as a result, we are seeing litigation risk in this space quite exponentially. So there's
Mhm.
increased scrutiny from regulators, increased scrutiny from investors. There's lawsuits galore around, misleading claims about environmental efforts or sustainability practices. Shareholders and consumer groups are increasingly filing class action lawsuits, and I think that's on the rise. I would say I place this in your emerging bracket, not necessarily because it's a new thing, but we're seeing more and more of this.
Right.
Um, I think regulatory frameworks are demonstrating and reflecting this as well. I only have to talk about things like, SEC requirements, the CSRD. Um, you're also seeing sort of competition law reflecting that. For example, in Canada, you have amendments to the competition law around, misleading claims and making sure you're substantiating your environmental claims and not misleading them. Securities fraud claims also relate to this as well. So
Mhm. Mhm.
it's just, the list is endless as far as, the legal and regulatory space and the litigation risk that exists when it comes to greenwashing issues. Um, so that's one thing. I think sticking to the environmental space further, I think there are issues around climate risk disclosures that I think absolutely at the sort of prevalent, I suppose, in the debate and discourse around ESG. Um, TCFD becoming more of a global benchmark for reporting. Net zero pledges as well, moving to that. I think that's something that is becoming a critical benchmark for attracting investment and contributing to global climate goals as well. And I think on the net zero issue, the trend that you see is something that reflects a move not sort of just focused on the energy sector, but beyond
Mhm.
that as well. That it's, you're seeing that move into a lot of other sectors, manufacturing, shipping, agriculture, and you're seeing sort of key strategies like carbon offsetting, green hydrogen, renewable energy adoption as well on that front. Um, it might be a good time, actually. I've talked about carbon offsetting. It might be a good time for me to just very quickly, it's not, I would say, my complete area of expertise, but certainly from a legal perspective and the work that I've done, I would say there's quite a big litigation risk around the carbon trading and emission reduction or a carbon market, I suppose, space because of the fact that this is relatively new, or at least voluntary carbon markets are relatively new. They're largely unregulated. They have varying standards and methodologies for carbon accounting. And that leaves the market vulnerable to litigation risk. So I think that's another sort of area that um, you see litigation risk, and but at the same time is also a bit of a trend, as you call it, in that there is more use of it, but more
Hmm.
risk
Hmm.
around it as well. Um, Certainly, you know, KLM, for example, was sort of in bother a couple of years ago around that, and that started. So that's just sort of one example. And I think the final point around um, trends and litigation purely on the environmental space, I would say, is biodiversity. Um, you hear the climate, 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 and I think there is that connected biodiversity piece, which is becoming more and more important. And you are having more of the sort of experts putting forward the case for biodiversity. And I don't think it should be neglected. I think the protection of biodiversity and ecosystems is now more and more being seen as a critical component of
Hmm.
long-term sustainability. I think people are recognizing that it's vital to prevent supply chain disruptions, to ensure agricultural productivity, to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And I think that is reflected in things like the TNFD becoming a bit more of an emerging framework for assessing the environmental impacts of business activities. So on the environmental side of this question, I think there are all of these different issues that are at play, and um, kind of equally
Hmm.
the litigation risk there as well. Now, given my, human rights and social expertise, I would be, an absolute I would be completely remiss of me essentially if I didn't talk about the social side.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think I think that's something that uh, definitely is I wouldn't again necessarily call it emerging, but is an area that is becoming much more important within the business world than ever before. And there are more litigation risks as well related to some of the laws that you're seeing in the regulatory developments, particularly in the EU. For example, you've had the CSDDD sort of recently come our way, and there will be companies
Hmm.
within Europe, but also outside of Europe that will need to comply with that. And that is all about the social due diligence within the supply chain. There's more in there around, workforce matters, ensuring that the workers are protected, that there's human rights impact assessments being completed and conducted. And this is something that I've been advocating for years, and occasionally being asked to do that for companies as a nice to have, but I'm really actually quite pleased that this is becoming more embedded within the legal and regulatory space. Um, and so, ESG litigation around things like supply chain transparency is on the up. Companies are increasingly being held accountable for labor conditions, for human rights violations. You already have domestic law, such as, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, also similarly in Australia. And then you also have the French duty vigilance law, you have German domestic law, the Netherlands and Denmark. They have sort of similarly got legislation around human rights issues and supply chain transparency. So again, I know that the nature of this podcast isn't for me to necessarily go into the nitty-gritty, but just to sort of give you a little bit of a taster of the landscape here, I think this is what we're seeing, and I'm sure we'll talk about it further later, but I don't see a lot of these issues going away. I would say that they're amplifying in nature more and more.
Yeah, I completely agree. So this leads me very well into the next question, which is what do you think 2025, the near term, has in store for ESG, both in the UK and globally with your global hat on?
Yes, thank you so much. So since I've already talked about the environment and some of the social issues, I think one of the things that might be worth mentioning is the role of technology,
Mm,
actually. I think um, I'm seeing it in my work more and more. I'm seeing it in the work of, counterparts, peers, other organizations, where the use of technology is playing a pretty big role or becoming a bigger part of the ESG work that they're doing. And so the impact of artificial intelligence, for example, the impact of technology as a whole, I think will be even more apparent in 2025. I think it's only going to get even more apparent as the years go on. But certainly, AI for ESG data analysis, that's so AI being increasingly used to analyze large data sets, to monitor ESG performance, to predict future risks.
mm,
I think that is becoming more apparent. And so, it's worth thinking about it in the sense of what that would mean for the legal and regulatory space. It's still an area that is not regulated in the core sense of the term, but
right.
there are tensions there around um, AI and data protection and privacy issues. Now, I say it's not regulated, but it is worth me mentioning that the European AI Act is something that companies are going to have to think about. So from the regulatory perspective, there is that, but I guess it's something that I think is becoming more and more apparent within the regulatory discussions. Is probably more what I mean. Um, and so, data privacy, responsible AI usage, I think is going to be, I think is incredibly important. And there needs to be more discussion around that and more emphasis around that. Uh, I think 2025 will be more of that,
Yes.
certainly for sure. And then just generally data-driven ESG, I think,
Mhm,
connected
mhm.
to that. Um, So yeah, I think that's going to be there. I think two other things that I probably would mention, other than the general sense that I think things are going to be more regulatory strengthened, I suppose, which I've talked about. I think there will be, of course, more greenwashing crackdowns. Um, and I think there's going to be more ESG within emerging markets. So obviously, developing nations definitely have started to prioritize ESG issues. Um, but I think more developing nations are requiring substantial capital to transition to more sustainable economies. And so there's a demand for ESG related investment critical to funding these transitions. I think also companies in developed markets are increasingly focused on ensuring that supply chains in emerging markets adhere to high environmental and social standards. So child labor, deforestation, and water management. So I think ESG in emerging markets is another area that I think 2025 there will be more of that within the debate and the discussions. So I'll stop there. I think there's a lot to talk through. And again, I hope that we'll, dissect that in the future at some point. But these are some of the snippets of things that I think will be here
Well,
for us in 2025.
I think you're right. And as I tell all my guests, I would love to have you back a year from now and talk about whether or not some of your predictions have come true. So given everything that is happening in this space, that it's just almost overwhelming on a day-to-day basis, what given this current challenging environment around ESG, what gives you hope? Every day we tackle some of these things, but what gives you hope, long-term hope?
Well, I hope that I see more business innovation and leadership, which I'm seeing. So
Mm-hmm.
the hope there is that whilst, there are debates and social media attention around the backlash against ESG, there's no
Mm-hmm.
denying that. I
Mm-hmm.
know that I've painted a really positive picture in in this podcast, and certainly I'm not naive to the fact that there is politicization around ESG. Certainly there is, some uh, sort of segments of society that perhaps are pushing back against it. But I do feel really positive about the business leadership and innovation that I'm seeing in this space, and that does give me hope. I hope that that will be facilitated even further. I hope that companies will continue to push the envelope in this space and realize that actually ESG principles can lead to long-term commercial success as well as, developmental or value success. And just sort of the recognition that ESG factors are not just moral imperatives. And I do see that reflected in some really good leaders, our own leader, our own CEO, certainly, but also a number of different leaders around the world that I'm seeing. I think the other thing that gives me hope is that institutional investors, including pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, have started to place more emphasis around sustainability. So the rising in impact investing, the rising green bonds, climate focused funds. That for me signals a growing awareness in the financial community that aligning investment strategies with ESG principles can lead to better risk adjusted returns over time. And so hopefully that will continue. Investors are increasingly prioritizing positive outcomes and driving demand for financial products that support sustainability and social goals. Um, and then, even though I don't necessarily think that everything should be overregulated, I do find hope in the policy and regulatory momentum that we're seeing. What that looks like in practice, I think people can disagree with. Okay, it's, be be practical, don't disclose, don't over disclose or over report. This is sort of some of the things that I'm hearing. And fine, you can disagree on what the nature or the inherent character or content of regulation looks like. But I think the fact that it is now becoming more mainstream for it to be incorporated in law and regulation for me is hopeful because my aspiration is that, ESG or whatever we want to call it, it could be ESG, it could be sustainability, it could be, taking a value-based approach or whatever sort of, label it has, that it will become more inherent within a system and not just a token effort or something supplemental. So that these some of the things that give me hope, and I will continue to hope.
And those are the same things that give me hope because I'm seeing some of the same things with my work. It's progress is being made despite some of the pushback or the anti-regulatory movement. And companies are realizing that it could be a differentiator in the short term, and in the long term, it's just good risk management and capitalizing on opportunities. So I also am hopeful for all the same reasons. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a delight to speak with you, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot.
Oh, thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine.
Well, it's not letting me stop recording. Hang on one second.